Whether you are currently going through this phase or is inevitably gravitating towards it, your 20s are basically the gatekeepers for the rest of your life. I know that sounds daunting because it feels exactly like so. There are many handbooks out there in the world, in print or through dialogues between you and your parents, relatives, basically anyone who has surpassed the test of their 20s. There isn't one that is exactly tailored to you because your life is like your fingerprint. Everyone has them, but none are the same. As I'm going through this defining decade of my life, I have something to share. Though I have not surpassed the mark of my 20s, and obviously do not have a clear view of my path in the future, I'm not rolling in money, nor do I have a salary job. I think it's still necessary to reflect while being stuck in the storm. It helps to admit to your mistakes, learn from them, and recenter your focus when need be. I wish I could travel back in time and share this podcast with myself before I open the doors to my 20s. But time traveling is currently unavailable, so instead of fighting against physics, I hope this episode can help you battle some of the voices of doubts in your life that are hindering you from seeing yourself. Since I cannot speak on everyone's behalf, I will speak for myself. A year ago, I graduated from a university with a degree in neuroscience. I hate to admit to the stereotypes, but as the eldest from an Asian American family, I was expected to become a doctor. Now, before I set foot in this 5-year journey, there were many things that had contributed to my decision to pursue this track. The big three being a scholarship, my tendency to help others, and filial obedience. I wanted to become a good person, someone who is valuable to society, someone who can make a difference in others' life, and as cheesy and generic as they may sound, among all things that were unclear in my life, those were my intuition. So I started undergrad as a chemistry major because I disliked biology, which should have been a big red flag considering that I was aiming to become a doctor whose job revolves around biology, but I digress. One semester later, I switched on over to the neuroscience department in hopes of sparking my interest in science again. But neuroscience is just a division of biology, so I am back at where I didn't want to be in the first place. 2 years later, I found myself stranded between what I wanted to do and what my parents wanted me to do. I am aware of my capabilities, so I was dumbfounded at how horrible pre-medicine was going for me. I studied hard, but it felt like pouring my hard work into a bottomless cup. My brain was refusing to retain anything I've learned because it was not something I truly wanted to do. So the only logical thing to do was to have a conversation with my parents, whom were very invested in my life and future endeavor. Now, could I have made my own decision on changing my track? Absolutely. But remember, filial obedience trumps all logic in a traditional Asian family, even if you're the one paying your own tuition. So I mustered all my courage to speak to my mother, and I was horribly shot down during that conversation. While I expressed my frustration with pre-med and wanting to switch to RTF major, where I can cultivate my creativity, she made it very, very clear to me that I need to become a doctor or become a lawyer. The rest is just irrelevant. I understood the immigrant mindset. I lived through it for the half of my life that was spent in the States. The American dream adds weight to the pressure that was already instilled in filial obedience. We were born to make our parents proud, and if we migrated overseas, the expectations are repackaged with a US dollar sign in the front. Pursuing in creative fields were widely perceived as unconventional and sometimes, in harsher terms, a disappointment. So I swept my conscience under the rug and proceeded with pre-med until I graduated. Then came MCAT, which was the entrance exam to get into medical school. Now at this point, my GPA was not where it's supposed to be, neither was my mental health. But sadly, mental health was a myth to my parents, and so I thought to myself that this was it. The MCAT was going to be the pivotal point that would set my life back on track. So I signed up for an intensive prep course 2 months before I was scheduled to take the test. And to sum up that experience, this course had condensed everything I've learned in college into 8 weeks. It was absolutely as terrible as it sounds, but I was right. This was a pivotal point that had set my mind back on track. Throughout the course, while we were relearning everything to prepare for the MCAT, it reminded me exactly why I hated it so much. There were days where I would go back to my apartment after a 3-hour prep class and cry in the shower because it felt meaningless to try for something I didn't yearn for. But I made a promise to myself that this would be the last thing that I would do for pre-med, for my parents. I missed the chance to embrace who I wanted to be as a college student. I missed the chance to make connections with people who would have influenced my career. I don't want to repeat my mistake and miss the chance to restart and reboot myself before it's too late. I love my parents. I would never, ever want to hurt them intentionally. But I've realized that it was unhealthy to sustain a delusional expectation at the expense of my well-being when my concerns were ignored. I've reached out to them multiple times, but it gets worse every time. I didn't want to hear those hurtful words from them, so I put on a mask and kept going. But it wasn't the right thing to do. I thought being obedient and making my parents happy would, in turn, make me happy as well. It didn't, and it took 5 painful years for me to come to that conclusion. MCAT was a hell of a test, and my scores were mediocre. It was not high enough to offset the disadvantages I had from my GPA. I didn't bother applying to enter medical school because that chapter was closed for me. Now, I just have to close it for my parents as well, which, as you expect, is not the easiest task to take down the final boss without a fight. So I fought at an In-N-Out drive-thru a week after my scores were released. My parents decided to pay me a visit after the test. I assumed that they expected good news, just as my mother assumed that I would become a doctor. But the only news I was there to deliver was the news that I was quitting pre-med. Many would say that silence can be suffocating, and I'm here to confirm that statement. It was the longest, yet bravest 15 minutes of my life. I stared down at my double burger and watched the tomato juice drip onto the table. I was convinced that if I had not rehearsed the scenario, those would have been my tears instead. It wasn't easy for my parents to accept my decision, but I did not expect them to. I only wish that they would respect my decision and have a little more confidence in my own judgment. Their intention behind this whole doctor career had meant well. At least I could sense that aside from the pride that comes with the title, their ultimate goal was to ensure that I had a solid income so that they can stop worrying about my future. It's a natural thing to do as parents, regardless of their ethnicity. But I've always been a creative individual. I find interest in curating in different mediums such as music, photography, films, skits, and sometimes poetry. But I could never present those creations to my parents without them drilling the fact that art forms are meant as hobbies rather than real careers. I knew that my parents loved me, but the societal pressure of how an immigrant story should end with achieving the American dream had confined me within boundaries that were preventing me from exploring my options in the land of the free. We're expected to uphold the Eastern mindset while being raised by Western culture. We're expected to maintain filial obedience while staying open-minded. The tug-of-war between who we are and what our parents want creates another layer of mesh that constricts us from expanding into the person that we're supposed to be. It would be naive for me to end on a positive note because life just ain't so. Just because I quit pre-med, it does not mean that all of a sudden I've reached an epiphany on who I'm supposed to be or what I was meant to do. I was back on square one. I felt like a freshman again, except that there isn't a track for me to follow, nor do I have a clue on where I was going. So I was basically an undeclared major at the University of Life. Because I spent my undergrad focusing on pre-medicine, everything I've done was contributing towards that goal. There were no room to consider other paths because, frankly, my plan A was my plan B because my parents wouldn't approve any other outcome except the one that would hang a white coat over my shoulder. I tried to explore some of the options that came to my head when I considered what would be an alternative career. I spent a few months learning how to do 3D modeling on Blender, looked into programs for UX design and graphic design, and applied for a few positions at various startup companies. But none of them felt right, and I was so frustrated. I was afraid to be static. I was afraid that I was making the same mistake by wasting my time again. So I kept applying to multiple places, got interviewed by a few, but one conversation stayed in my head for a while. I was interviewed at a local company. My interviewer was impressed by my resume, so I was introduced to speak with the COO on the same day. She looked over my resume and asked a few questions, which I replied confidently. Then she paused and looked at me in the eye and asked, "With your education and credentials, why are you here?" My mind blanked out because truly, I have no answer for that. I was wandering directionless, trying to hold on to anything that would make a decent living, trying to secure something that would feed my student loan and hopefully myself. I was falling back into the same pattern. In college, everything I've done was for pre-med. Now that I've graduated, everything I'm doing is for student loan. The burden of my student loan became the new pre-med for me, and I didn't stop and take a second to analyze myself. What can I do with my experiences now that I'm no longer attached to the medical field? And sometimes it's hard to see things from your own perspective, especially when you're swimming in your own thoughts. So I, too, called in some friends for help and advice. It took a 3-hour Skype session that was stretched across 3 different states to pull all of our brain cells together to realize that there was something for me all along. While I was stuck in pre-med during undergrad, there was a club which I've dedicated all 4 years to. It was a nonprofit student organization that aimed to raise money towards nurturing, education, and rehabilitation programs for medically disadvantaged orphans in China. Because it was not a social club and the amount of work we had to do in order to live up to our mission, it was a very small crew filled with a handful of people who were in it for the cause. I joined because I wanted to give back to my community. I stayed because I was able to witness the impact of our efforts from our sponsored families abroad and from the adoptees we interacted with within the community. Because this club did not directly contribute towards pre-med, it was the one thing that I pursued with my own conscience. My friends were quick to point out that I had a thing for humanitarian efforts. I love the idea of humanitarian works, But at the same time, I knew it was something that my parents would not approve of due to the lowercase $sign that is attached to said occupation when compared to the uppercase $sign that comes with getting a job as a physician. Though I was afraid to discover this, it made sense. In fact, it made a lot of sense. In December of 2019, my significant other and I traveled to a rural town in Japan to document the lives after a tragic event. Despite facing various obstacles, the entire project from start to finish had fulfilled something that was missing for a long time since I left my club. The lives that we witnessed, the sacrifices we made, the trips we took, and the stories we told are now connected like an arrow that points to one thing. This is what I wanted to do all along. Someone who is valuable to society, someone who can make a difference in others' life, someone like this. I could utilize my creativity to help spread awareness for those who really need to be heard on multiple platforms. I can be the vessel that would bring more good to this world. And that was something valuable I didn't expect to figure out so soon. I've always been a firm believer that everything happens for a reason. Despite the fact that I resented my time spent as a pre-med student, everything I've experienced and the skills I've developed were not coincidence. Perhaps it was necessary to go through all of that to break free, to arrive at this conclusion, and to become the person that I am today. Though nothing much has changed, I'm still on the run. I'm now running towards a goal. It may be a marathon that would take years to complete, but taking that first step, knowing it's something I wanted to mark my life with, just feels so damn good. I know I've said these words before, but I felt inspired by them, so I would plagiarize myself and say it again for the people in the back, or to my younger self if time traveling ever becomes an option. Everything happens for a reason. You should be the one in control of your life. Regardless of the outcomes from your decisions, you are the one in power. Your hand spins the roulette, and the game is just starting for us. You are a blank sheet of paper that is capable of anything you decide to mark it with. This is your 20s, the defining decade of your life, so be as colorful as you like. Thanks for tuning in to the second episode of Lactose Intolerant. I will see you next week.